Please welcome back to the Castro stage, Sam Pollard. And Linda Harrison from the Museum of the African Diaspora. Well, what a film.
Thank you very much.
I have to, I know that we introduced you earlier, and I won't repeat all of the wonderful things that Sam has done in his 30 years of being a writer, a producer, a director, but I do want to mention that I remember purchasing my copy of the box CD set of Eyes on the Prize, and I want you to know that that was also one of his Emmy-winning awards for writing, and I'm just thrilled to have you here in San Francisco with us here in the Castro Theatre.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
I thought I might start with sharing a story, my Sammy story, with you and with the audience. I remember growing up in Chicago, south side of Chicago. My grandmother raised me. She owned a beauty salon, and it was called a beauty shop back then, and there was the ever-present Ebony and Jet magazines. And you read Ebony and Jet. And I remember my grandmother and her crew, that would be my aunts and uncles and her friends, talking about Sammy Davis Jr. and that, and I quote, "that cool Negro has made enough money to become a Jew." This is how we thought of it. We literally thought, now this is the same set of adults that talked about passing. This was something that I heard a lot of conversation about, and it was in that same spirit that, well, he is now Jewish, and he's passing. And this is a good thing as long as you pass for the good of the race. And I remember this because I just had to always keep up with what is happening with this person named Sammy Davis Jr. In Ebony and Jet magazine. And so that led me to my first question to you around the part of the film that deals with, after Sammy's accident, he wanted to really delve more into a religion. And he was raised Catholic, but he decided that that religion was going to be the Jewish religion. And I know that I'll say it, the showbiz, the Jewish glitterati of the showbiz world really embraced him. But what was the Jewish community thinking? What was the average American Jewish family, much like my family on the south side of Chicago, what were they reading in the Jewish magazines, or what were they talking about around their living rooms on this man and his wife, Miss Britt, converting to become Jews?
You know, when I was doing my research, one of the things that I realized was that, you know, a lot of people, at that time, if people remember, the Jewish and the black community were really tied together through the civil rights movement. And Sammy saw that connection, and he felt a strong kinship with the Jewish community. And he also tells the story that after he had the accident, he was in the hospital, and a rabbi came to visit him, you know, and started to talk to him. And he felt this connection. He felt that he wanted to find a spiritual center, and Judaism was a spiritual center that he found. Now, in screening this film at so many festivals, always the question I'm asked is, was he serious about his conversion? And he was. You know, he was very serious about his conversion. And he seemed to be embraced by not only the Jewish community, but the black community at the time. And as you can see in the film, Sammy was a very complicated man, very complicated. So I think they embraced him in the late 50s and the 60s, but as you can see by the 70s, he had his own issues with the black community,
Right. I did. I didn't see a lot about that process that he and his wife went through, and it could appear that, well, he made this transition, but there was still a lot of hatred around him being so open about being Jewish.
I think the hatred was not only about being Jewish, but the fact that he was a black man who was marrying a white woman. We had these laws in America at that time. You couldn't marry in certain states a white woman, and he had to deal with that. He had to confront that. But my Brit, who Sammy married in 1960, she decided to convert to Judaism before she married Sammy, because that's how strong she felt the religion was for him, and she wanted to connect to him, and she wanted to raise her children in Judaism.
Do you think that becoming Jewish also opened yet other doors for him, or was it still really because he was a black man?
I don't know if it opened any doors for Sammy. I think that there were always these doors that were closed to him that he was trying to break through all the time. I mean, when he tells you that story, when he tells a story about being in the army and he gets into the fight with the white soldier, and the white soldier, he breaks the white soldier's nose, and the white soldier's nose says, "You may have beaten me now, but you're still a nigger." Right. He had to still confront that all the time. So I don't think he felt that the Judaism was going to open up any doors for him. I think part of it also, too, was that he grew up in show business, and as you said, he was surrounded by people like Eddie Cantor. He was an admirer of Al Jolson, many performers from the Jewish community. I mean, if you think about Sammy Davis Jr. and what he did as a singer, dancer, actor, and you look at Eddie Cantor did the same stuff. He was a singer, he was a dancer, he was an actor. These were show business people who had to be multi-talented and multifaceted to make a mark, and Sammy wanted to do that. And he admired these people. That's what made him connect to them.
He sort of wanted to transcend being the black entertainer.
He was
and
trying.
Be the
he was
entertainer.
trying.
He was trying. He called himself a colored, one-eyed Puerto Rican Jew.
Right.
Now today, because I am the director, I run a museum called the Museum of the African Diaspora, and we're pretty easy to talk about being Afro-Cuban, Afro-Jewish, Afro-Asian, Afro-Brazilian. But then that was a pretty revolutionary.
That was revelatory.
Totally, a revolutionary act. And so you eloquently unpacked all of these extended identities. Do you think that Sammy thought of himself as a race man? And I say a race man, just in case you know what I'm talking about, a race man. But for my Jewish brothers and sisters, a race man or race woman is a person living their life for the good of the race. And for an example, my grandmother said, you know what, I'm going to do everything I can with this little beauty shop on the South Side, and so that people can vote. And she had voting machines, and she'd feed people if they needed to be fed so that they could vote. But you live for the good of the race. Do you think that Sammy considered himself a race man of his time?
Not in the 50s, not in the 60s, not in the early 60s. I think Sammy's idea was that he wanted to transcend race. He wanted to be accepted. He wanted to be accepted in the white world. That's what he wanted. He wanted to be accepted in the white world. So he was struggling with that. He was struggling with the issues of identity, in the 50s and in the early 60s. It was only when he interacted with Belafonte and Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee that he became more conscious. It's when he started to meet the Black Panthers, he became more conscious. But Harry Belafonte was a race man, but Sammy wasn't quite.
Right. And I think that in the film he talks about how Harry Belafonte was one of those people that helped him get there.
I mean, think about it. Here he goes. I mean, Harry Belafonte wants him to go down to Alabama, and Sammy's reluctant. Sammy's reluctant. He supported the movement. He gave money to the SCLC and the NAACP, but when he was asked to go on the front lines, he said, "Whoa, I got to do Golden Boy." And it was Harry who said, "I'll buy out the house," to persuade
Right.
Sammy to go down there. He was a reluctant activist.
So he had to evolve to be
He had to evolve.
a race man and then ultimately an activist.
He had to evolve.
That brings up the issue of a lot of people, whether they were white or black, were really thought after the Nixon incident, him hugging Nixon, and him going to Vietnam to support the troops,
Right.
that he was a sellout. That really, hey, that's it. We're not. You have left the building on being a black man representing our race, and I think a lot of white people thought that he was a sellout. It was just, how could he do it?
Because as you remember in the clip, David Steinberg or someone says Sammy would hug anybody. He was a guy who always was looking to show affection. He wasn't thinking about the reaction in terms of what would happen after he hugged Nixon. He just did it. He just did it. Then when he got the backlash, he said, "Oh, what did I do?" So here, and then the other thing to think about it too, here was a man who in 1960 had supported JFK in his run for the White House and the presidency, and then at the inaugural ball, he said he's been disinvited. And then maybe 8 years later, 10 years later, another man who's the president of the United States, a Republican, says, "Sammy Davis, we want you, we want to embrace you." And he's an entertainer. He wants love. He's looking for, attention. So Nixon invites him to the White House, invites him to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom. He's found Shangri-La, but at a price.
It was at a price. What struck me was that his contemporary, James Brown,
Did the same thing.
also went to entertain the troops, openly supported Nixon's re-election,
Right.
and campaigned for Reagan, and he was under the radar. Why Sammy being called out and James Brown, who really didn't come up with "I'm black and I'm proud" until the 70s, why was he not called out?
That's a good question. I mean, he caught some backlash, but not the way that Sammy caught it. I think it's the notion of. I mean, listen. When you're raised in America during that period that I grew up in, you grew up in, basically they say to you, forget where you come from, become part of the American melting pot. Forget this notion that you're just an African American or you're a Jewish American. Just be an American. And sometimes some of African Americans did buy into that. Sammy bought into it because you want to be, you want to make it in America.
Right. Because we really have been trained to make it in America.
That's right.
You need to be as white as you could possibly be.
That's exactly right.
And that was just for the everyday person as well. I mean, I grew up knowing that I wanted to work for IBM or something.
But it's also about the images that you see, that you grow up with. You grow up and you see all these images on the silver screen, and he sees Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart and Edward G. Robinson. Those are the people that he emulates. That's what you see. I mean, I was watching this movie the other day with Robert Taylor, who plays this guy who's trying to start a railroad, and he decides to sell off his property. And he's got this black family, and the guys who are trying to sell off, they try to sell off the family separately, and Robert Taylor says, "No, you got to sell them all as a family." And the black man, who's his butler, says to him, "Mr. Taylor, or whatever his character's name, I don't really want to leave you because I raised you." I said, "Jesus."
You see,
America.
and we're
America.
and I don't know if people really think about whether it's Spike Lee or whether it's Sam Pollard. Here we are looking at films when we're kids. I'm watching Cary Grant.
That's right.
I'm thinking I can grow up to be Cary Grant.
That's right.
I mean, you just it's just this adaptation that we have, and you know, it brings to mind what was one of your what was your favorite filmmaker or really filmmaker and director as that inspired you to become this prolific director and editor?
It was John Ford.
John Ford.
Wasn't Spike Lee. He wasn't around.
Right. I mean,
Ford.
that's how, so we look at Sammy as going, I just want to be the
right.
best that I can be. I think this came out in his wanting to do impressions and thinking, hey,
All
this
of
is
it,
going to be
sure.
really good. And but his uncles thought, no, don't ever do that again, because you could not do impressions of
That
white
was
people.
taboo. That was taboo back then to do
Yeah.
that, you know, and that was something I realized in the research. That was taboo for a black man to imitate a white actor.
Were there other areas when you took over the film? Were there surprises in terms of the history? I know that you knew about Sammy, but were there some surprises along the way as you were developing who this person really was that you were going to present to us?
Well, the surprise was that surprise. I never knew that, you know, there was this thing about black actors imitating white actors. I didn't really knew that. I thought I knew everything about the history, but I didn't know that. The other thing that was a big surprise to me really was, I always knew that Sammy was very talented, but when we found this archival footage of him playing with those two drummers, dancing with those two drummers, I had never seen that material before. I thought it was phenomenal, just absolutely phenomenal, you know. Yeah. You know. And it really impressed me because by the time I saw Sammy Davis in the 60s, he wasn't dancing as much. You know, he was doing his comedy act, he was acting, he was singing more. Not as much dancing, but that was phenomenal footage.
Yeah, from that piece, it reminded me of how many contemporary dancers and artists, whether they sing and dance, really were perhaps influenced
Right.
By him.
And one of the other things that we found as we were working on the film, we went to his archive and we found those audio tapes that you hear throughout the film, and I'd never heard how upset he was about being disinvited by JFK, you know, from not being able to go to the inauguration. That was like, to hear him say he was really disappointed and very hurt.
I don't know if I even knew this before your film, and what was puzzling to me is that Harry Belafonte was married to a white woman at the same time that they both were invited to Frank's party for President Kennedy. And yet, Sammy was uninvited. He was invited, then uninvited.
Yeah, that's right.
And I don't know if the archives revealed why Sammy was then disinvited. What was it, because Kennedy told him not to get married before the election?
Kennedy had not wanted him to marry My Brit before the election because of his association with the Rat Pack. But Sinatra had said to Sammy, you should go ahead and marry Mai anyway. And he always listened to what Sinatra said. But then after he married Mai and he wanted to come to the inaugural, then Kennedy disinvited him. And this time Sinatra said, you shouldn't come, which also hurt Sammy because how close he was to Frank Sinatra. You know, I mean, when you look at that footage, you see Sidney Poitier there, Ella Fitzgerald there, Harry
Right.
Belafonte there.
So
You know?
it wasn't, that's what I was thinking, it wasn't the black thing.
No, it was the fact that he had a white, blonde wife.
And Harry,
He had a wife too, but didn't look like she was white.
and then Harry was the fairer of
Yeah,
the
he was-
Negroes, and this is something
Yeah.
that during that time in the 60s or 50s before,
He was a matinee idol.
right,
Harry was a matinee idol. So.
this, it brings up the question on all of this bro love that was happening between Sammy and the Rat Pack and loving each other, but then Sammy really idolizing Frankie because that was like a role model, and then here Frankie wanted to really be accepted by the Kennedys,
Right.
In particular by the president, and that situation really just almost broke. It appeared that it broke Sammy. And do you know if?
Well, you got to think about it this way. I mean, him and Sinatra had this sort of older brother, younger brother relationship, right? Sinatra was the big brothers, and Sammy was the little brother. And through the years, there'd be times where Sammy and Frank would have falling outs, you know, and then they would repair and they would come back together. And this was one of these times where Sinatra didn't support Sammy, you know. I mean, they had another falling out years later when Sammy got into the cocaine. Sinatra stopped talking to him for a few years, you know. So they had this. I mean, Sinatra was a very, very mercurial man too. So this was a very complex relationship. But Sammy Davis Jr., he accepted it. He dealt with it because he loved Frank Sinatra. As the film said, if he couldn't be anything, he could want to be Frank Sinatra. If he could be anything.
Even after the big Kennedy betrayal.
He wanted to be Frank Sinatra.
No.
Me and my shadow.
Oh no, really?
When they're dancing together.
Well, that's true. That's true. I was also struck by the images that you used to close the film. You had a running set of images of entertainers, but you had a lot of images of Sammy shooting film behind the camera. Did he want to be was he a photographer? Did he want to be a director, or?
He didn't want to be a director, but as you could see, Sammy was a singer, dancer, drummer, could play the trumpet, could play the vibraphone. Jerry Lewis introduced him to photography, and he took it up, and a lot of those pictures you see in the end credits are Sammy's pictures. He took a lot of those pictures. So he was a prolific photographer. He loved shooting stills. There's a book that was done of all Sammy's stills. And, you know, he was just a guy who was a curious man. He was not educated, but he had a lot of curiosity. And he wanted to always learn new things. And he wanted to learn to be a photographer, which he did. He's a good one. You know, he's a very talented guy.
Did you see in this process of making this feature, did you see another documentary within some of the archives information that you found out? Is there another story, or whether it's about Sammy or someone else in the film?
I'm not sure what you're getting.
Well, what I'm getting at in looking at Sammy's work and some of the photography, all of the photography that he did, I wasn't sure whether there was yet another documentary, a part 2, out of this to continue the story.
Is there a filmmaker out there who wants to do? I'm not sure it's me.
To do the part 2 of this. So let me ask you, you're working on, you've worked on like multiple projects sometimes at one time. What's up next? What are you working on now?
There's a couple of
after
projects. I'm working now on a 6-part series that's being executive produced by a great documentary filmmaker, Alex Gibney, and Steven Spielberg, called Why We Hate. That's going to be on Discovery next spring. That looks at the hate and where it comes from and how it evolves, and the things it can lead to, like genocide. So I'm doing that, and I'm also working with another director on my own, another passion film, a documentary I've been trying to get off the ground for years about a wonderful composer, drummer, Max Roach.
Oh yeah.
Played with Charlie Parker and Dizzy and Monk. And that's been a project close to my heart. I'm trying to get off the ground. So, always, my attitude is, as a filmmaker, as someone who's trying to be creative, I'm trying to find things that stimulate me and keep me excited and keep me wanting to make films, to tell stories, complex stories, rich stories about people, our people, you know, which is very important to me. Something I learned from a wonderful documentary filmmaker named St. Clair Bourne many years ago.
Well, you know, I think I had read that you said it, well, and when we were talking about wanting to be, transcend blackness and be a lot more like the white establishment, but then there was a turn where you wanted to also represent really through your medium, through your film and editing,
You did your
the
research.
black experience.
You did your research. Yeah, it was for me.
They told me I had to do that.
It was for me. I was 30 years old and I was working on a film about Chicago blues. And I was working with a gentleman named St. Clair Bourne, documentary filmmaker, African American. And I spent 6 months with him in the editing room. And he made me understand that as a person of color, as an African American, we had a responsibility to tell our stories. I had sort of forgotten that as I was sort of struggling to make it in the business. He made me understand that was an important thing I had to deal with. So from that point on, if I had this project that I was involved with or I was trying to get a project off the ground, it was about telling our stories. And Saint was an important figure in that, telling our stories. So that led to Eyes on the Prize, that led to August Wilson, that led to Zora Neale Hurston, that led to I'll Make Me a World, and that's been part of my mantra, you know, since that time. That was 1980.
I love that. It took me a moment as I realized all of the work that I did in corporate America and trying to be the perfect, well, really just trying to emulate what that meant in the white world. And here I am now enjoying telling the stories of artists from the African diaspora.
That's right.
And in doing that, that's where the difference is, and that's where people hear and see different stories.
Okay.
I think that this might be a good time to transition to a couple of questions from the audience.
You can see them, I can't see it.
Of course, we can't see with the lights, right?
Now I can see. This is humid up here.
I know, it's the lights.
Oh boy.
Do we have someone walking back with the mic to? So we're going to have you actually ask your questions with the mic, because that way then the house will be able to hear it. Yes.
Hi. I wanted to thank you, Sam, not only for this fantastic film, long overdue, about one of the greatest entertainers I've ever seen, who entertained with two other entertainers that were the greatest I've ever seen in Las Vegas and North Shore of Tahoe. But also for you and to you and Henry Hampton for one of the two great seminal series of public broadcasting that were made in consecutive years. Ken Burton's The Civil War in 1990 and Your Eyes on the Prize the year before. Thank you for those great things that you've done, Sam.
Thank you very much.
One quick question. In the controversy about the Sammy not being invited to the inaugural gala for JFK, which, by the way, was shown on PBS about a year ago. A friend of mine pulled that together. And wasn't Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, fairly influential in the barring of Sammy?
That's what the story is. I'm not 100% sure it was all Joseph Kennedy, but that's what people say. It was Joseph Kennedy who said to JFK, "You can't have that guy come to the inaugural." That's exactly right.
One quick thing, too, I wanted to mention, since the Museum of the African Diaspora is involved here, another colleague of mine in public television had a lot to do with the founding of that. I'd like to recognize former KPIX and KQED news anchor Belva Davis.
Yes. Is Belva she probably is not here this evening, but Belva Davis and former Mayor Willie Brown were instrumental 14 years ago. The museum is 13 years old. 14 to 15 years ago, this was a vision of former Mayor Willie Brown and Belva Davis, and they were adamant that there would be a black museum in the heart of the Yerba Buena district. And now we are happy that we are a thriving museum in that district.
Yes, sir.
Yes. I'll repeat that question. The question was wondering why there were not interviews with any of Sammy's children.
I tried my darndest to interview Tracy Davis, his oldest child, his daughter. And as I was saying to Linda and them at dinner, I had a crew lined up in Nashville where she lives. She had promised she would come do an interview in Nashville. I had a crew, I had makeup, I had sound, camera. I showed up with my crew at this location in Nashville. She was supposed to arrive at 12:30. She never showed up. I stayed around till 3 o'clock with phone calls and texts. I sent the production assistant out to her house, no response, and I never heard from Tracy Davis until not even today. So she was the one I wanted to interview. I never decided to interview the sons, but I wanted to interview her. I did interview Sammy's stepson, Manny Davis, who now is the executive of the estate, but in all honesty, his interview wasn't so good, so I didn't put it in.
Question?
Which one? My Brit's alive, but she would only do an interview if Tracy would do an interview. So since Tracy didn't do it, Mai wouldn't do it.
Question? Midway?
Wonderful film. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what must have been his self-education, because he actually struck me with his eloquence, and I was very surprised to hear he never went to school.
Yeah, he's extremely articulate. You can hear that. And he never did go to school, but he tells a story, which is not in the film, that when he went into the service, he wasn't much of a reader, but he had a drill instructor, a sergeant, who gave him Charles Dickens' Tales of Two Cities and told him to read it from cover to cover. And he was voracious, and he read it, and he loved it. And I think a lot of Sammy's articulation come from watching these old movies, quite honestly. He had in his house, in the old days, you know, VHSs. He had stacks and stacks of VHSs of all these films. He could imitate Ronald Colman, Jimmy Stewart, Charles Lawton. You know, I think he listened to these actors. He was a great mimic. And I think he learned to articulate by listening to all these actors who had these refined voices. Because he's a wonderful, wonderful speaker, Sammy is. But he was also curious, and so he read a lot. After that experience in the Army, he just was a reader all the time, you know.
Dawn, thank you so much for this film. I just was weeping and marveling at this film. And thank you again for Eyes on the Prize. That was a very important series.
Thank you, sir.
You had asked how Jewish families or Jews felt when he converted. And I remember hearing Sammy Davis's name a lot when I was a child and how proud my parents were that he was part of the tribe. So I just wanted to tell you that.
Great, thanks.
We were proud too. It was like magic. How do you do that? We have time for one more question. In the back to the right.
I was wondering, of all the accolades that he had, was he ever nominated by the Academy for motion pictures, for Oscars or whatnot? And whether or not, if he won or not, what his reaction might have been to that?
He was never nominated. He was a presenter at a few of the Academy Awards, but he was never nominated. I think he was nominated for some Emmys for that. He had a television show in the 60s. But I don't think I don't think Sammy ever had a substantial enough role, except for one film that we used some clips from, A Man Called Adam, that he did with Cicely Tyson in 1966. You know, that's probably his strongest dramatic performance. But he never had enough roles that were strong enough to garner a nomination.
I think that is our final question. And
thank you very much for coming out. I'm glad you had a chance to see the film.
And Sam, we thank you for this film. Thank you all.